Hello and welcome into the GSMC Sports Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host TJ Mabardi. Today is Wednesday, June 19th. We are a little bit over 24 hours now from the Boston Celtics winning the 2024 championship. We did about an hour on it yesterday, so I sort of want to give some final thoughts here moving forward to start off the show as we begin to look ahead to the NBA offseason. And we have already gotten a number of different transactions and even an official signing of a star player that we are going to dive into today, along with the fact that just earlier today, the Detroit Pistons decided to fire head coach Monty Williams. They gave him the record deal just last offseason and are already going full house. So I want to sort of also dive into options for the Pistons and how that job compares to those of the Lakers and the Cavaliers. We're going to be talking about OG Anunoby, who does not seem to be close on contract extensions with the New York Knicks. Meanwhile, Pascal Siakam, one of the other big trade acquisitions during the regular season, has already solidified himself with his new team. And then finally, we are going to end off the show with a hockey segment, wrapping up on the Game 5 victory from the Edmonton Oilers, who continue to keep their season alive. But before we get into everything, just a reminder to like, follow, subscribe wherever you keep up with us. To any of our viewers, be sure to use the comment section to give us your thoughts on all the latest happenings in sports as we try and make this show as interactive as possible. And if you would like to become a bigger part of the show, you can use the link that is streaming across the bottom ticker, gsmcpodcast.net. If you leave a comment along with a tip or donation, it'll pop up on screen for everybody to see. Anything would be greatly appreciated on that front. The Boston Celtics, it is being very heavily covered right now that they, of course, have won the 2024 NBA Finals. We did a whole hour on it just yesterday, so I want to start off the show here by just giving some final thoughts on both the finals and this overall postseason for the NBA. And there's obviously so many different angles to talk about when you are discussing this Celtics championship. I feel like yesterday we were talking a lot about the collective of this Celtics team, but there are a couple people in that Celtics organization that I do feel like this has to be a little bit extra gratifying for, starting with Jaylen Brown, who became the highest paid player in NBA history last offseason. Now that is sure to be soonly history itself, where there's going to be a couple stars that will probably make more money than him this offseason, including his own teammate in Jason Tatum. But last year, it was Brown becoming the first $300 million man in the NBA, at least based off of solely team contracts. And the timing of it really wasn't great in terms of where the PR of Jaylen Brown was after the team had a really embarrassing loss to the Miami Heat in the Eastern Conference Finals, playing the 7th seeded Heat, and based off of, or the 8th seeded Heat, I should say, and the fact that in Game 7, we see Jason Tatum roll his ankle in the first minute or so of that game, and people were sort of looking to Jaylen Brown to, come up with something and establish himself as the star that the team needed in that instance, but he couldn't in that game, and it was just a really rough series for him as a whole. I believe he finishes 8 of 23 in Game 7. We saw through the entirety of that postseason series that the Heat were maybe exposing Jaylen Brown a little bit in terms of his deficiencies from a ball handler standpoint. Averaged 3.6 turnovers per game, Jaylen did, and that's somebody who obviously has tons of talent and ability to create on the ball, but that's never really been his role with the Celtics. So that 3.6 was pretty devastating for the Celtics at the time, but ultimately it clearly pushed him to continue improving. Jaylen Brown, I think, has been the epitome of somebody who offseason after offseason continues to get better. And some of the ball handling stuff was definitely part of that conversation, but also for Jaylen, it was, and not just Jaylen, of course, Jason Tatum is involved in this as well, is the maturity aspect of them understanding that they need to adapt and if they ever want to win a finals together. And I think that that's exactly what they did. And for Jaylen Brown to receive all of the criticism that he did during the offseason and even early on in the year, I know at least from myself living in Massachusetts, there was a lot of negativity towards him from a lot of the local Boston media outlets in terms of, well, this is the guy we're paying all that much money to. And I never thought it was a question that Jaylen Brown, especially with his history, is never going to be a negative asset. And in fact, he proved to be one of the most valuable assets as he goes on to win Finals MVP. And especially after he was snubbed from All-NBA this season, he's talked about how he felt like he should have been All-Defense. I'll just leave it at that. Don't know if I necessarily am there with him on it, but for him to be as important as he was during these playoffs, winning the Eastern Conference Finals MVP and the Finals MVP, nobody can say anything about his contract anymore. And also, for whatever it's worth, I feel like the fact that he did win these awards instead of Jason Tatum probably gives Tatum still a little bit more to push towards, where as much as this season was just about winning the championship, winning a Finals MVP is going to be something on Jason Tatum's checklist that he is desperately going to want to cross off. So that is almost a little bit of a benefit for the Celtics that he didn't end up winning it this year. But the other person I really want to highlight here is Joe Mazzulla, who deserves a ton of credit. Another person who, especially, again, I think from a national media perspective, definitely got some flack. But I know here in Boston, it was not a great rookie head coach season for Joe Mazzulla. And that's where, again, we can absolutely, praise him for what he is now, because I think that the growth has been tremendous. Last season was very rough at times, and the whole situation leading into him being put in this position of Ime Udoka and his off the court stuff, coming off of a finals appearance, puts that much pressure on Joe Mazzulla. And then also considering the fact that Udoka ended up getting hired by the Rockets partway through last year, so a lot of Mazzulla's assistant coaches, which he didn't even pick out himself headed into the year, they end up leaving him, and it's a very bare bones coaching staff, and he's just sort of put out there into the fire to fend for himself. And the improvement from year one to year two has been absolutely tremendous for him. So I think that he deserves a lot of praise for the way that he was able to adapt and the ways that he was able to learn from his mistakes in year one. But outside of just the Celtics, because me personally, I am a Celtics fan, so I was definitely entertained myself because the Celtics were winning the first finals that I've ever really been able to appreciate. But, overall with this playoffs, it was pretty underwhelming just in terms of, I love basketball. I have fun watching these games and just analyzing everything anyways, but it feels like there was an absence of these classic games. And the Celtics, they go on to win the championship. They never really had their backs up against the wall. Now, their biggest moment, I would say, comes in game one of the Eastern Conference Finals where they were playing the Indiana Pacers. It took a couple turnovers there from Indiana, the big shot from Jaylen Brown in the corner, and then Jason Tatum taking over in overtime. That felt like the biggest moment for this Celtics playoff run. But overall, again, they just weren't super heavily tested, which in the eyes of a lot of people too sort of diminishes their playoff run. I think it means that they were just that dominant that there wasn't ever really any drama with them. But outside of just the Celtics lens of all of this, we got just 3 Game 7s, and wasn't exactly a super compelling group of them. The Pacers destroyed the Knicks 130-109, and that is sort of baked into the other conversation here of we just saw so many stars injured, which definitely hurt the overall quality and intrigue of the playoffs. But Game 7, Pacers and Knicks wasn't really anything. It was a really strange one between the Denver Nuggets and the Minnesota Timberwolves in the Western Conference semifinals as well, where the two teams basically took turns blowing each other out, and the Wolves ended up winning by 8. It wasn't this, demolishing type of competition, but Minnesota took a double-digit lead in that game with 3 minutes left, and I didn't really think that there were any doubts from there on out, at least, the feel of the game from as I was watching. Maybe I'm being too critical. Maybe you still felt like the Nuggets were going to be able to come back, but it didn't make it out to be what should have and could have been this iconic Game 7 matchup between two of the best teams in the league. And then really, in my opinion, the best of the Game 7s was the Cleveland Cavaliers versus the Orlando Magic in the first round. And it was Donovan Mitchell versus Paolo Banchero, and both of them were tremendous in this game. Donovan Mitchell was on an all-time heater from Game 6 and Game 7, combining for 89 points. Just a tremendous closeout effort there from him. And the fact that the Cavaliers were down by, I think it was 18 points in this game during the first half, and they pulled off the biggest Game 7 comeback since 1998. But people just didn't care as much about this series and about these teams. Neither one of them were really considered true contenders. The Magic never got any of the credit that they kind of deserved during the regular season. No national media games, basically. So maybe they had one, but people just weren't really all familiar with the Magic, and neither one of these teams really played, the most aesthetically appealing game, at least in 2024, where at least the Magic are solely built off of defense and, star creation from Paolo Banchero. But I thought it was interesting that John Lewis of Sports Media Watch wrote an article about how the playoffs saw a significant decline in viewership and ratings from last year. Ratings were down 11%, viewership down by 12%, and reported that the finals have gone 5 straight years now without any game reaching 14 million viewers at any point. And he added some context as well that in the MLB, the World Series in 2021 hit that 14 million viewers mark as well. So obviously there are a number of different things that sort of play into this. Listen, I understand there are a number of illegal streaming sites as well that do take away a little bit from the viewership numbers, but the fact of the matter still is that we haven't really gotten a number of these classic games in some times. Where you look at the past 5 finals, the last 2 of them were just 5 games between Celtics and Mavs and Nuggets and Heat last season. Only one of the last 5 finals had the average margin of victory in single digits. The average score differential in 2023 between the Nuggets and Heat was 9.4, and that was the lowest. So we're getting a ton of blowout games in these finals as well, and we haven't gotten a Game 7 since 2016 during the Warriors and Cavaliers series. So we're getting blowouts. We're not getting these long drawn-out series. It feels like, for the most part, we're getting, I would say, at least a lot of sort of foregone conclusions. Now 2022, the Warriors were favored. There was a lot of, those ESPN analytics stats that get thrown out about the Celtics and how they should have won that series, and the overall arc could have been entertaining, but average margin of victory in that series was 13.3. Not a single one of those games finished as a single-digit point differential. And it just stinks because, again, the NBA is so much fun. And, I personally love basketball. Again, I'm always going to be tuning into these games. But it doesn't feel like we're getting this climax that we feel like we should be getting in terms of, the postseason just not really living up to expectations. And, again, not totally sure what that is. Injuries definitely do play some sort of a role there. But also when you look at how this playoffs played out, it was the Celtics who were far and away the best team in the Eastern Conference, even with injuries to the Bucks, and you can say to the Sixers to some degree with Joel Embiid, even though he played, and with, the Knicks as well. I don't think any of those teams were beating the Celtics. And, then you go to the Western Conference, the top three teams, and the Nuggets, Timberwolves, and Mavericks, all of them were fully healthy, but we still just didn't get, again, it was sort of trading off blowouts. And I don't know if it's the 3-point variance that sort of comes into play there or what it is, but ultimately it was overall a pretty disappointing playoffs. But let me know if you think I'm being too down on the dumps. Again, I love the NBA. I'm always going to watch it. But when you look at the NHL playoffs and the excitement of basically every one of those games, it just doesn't feel like there is an equivalence. But again, let me know your thoughts in the comments section. We're going to be taking our first break of the show, though, and when we come back on the other side, we have some breaking news to dive into with the Detroit Pistons firing their head coach, Monty Williams. So stick with us, and we will be right back after this quick break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing. Sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown. Get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, no, this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose, if it's some moosey shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast as we turn the page here to the NBA offseason. We got some news earlier this morning that the Detroit Pistons have decided to fire their head coach, Monty Williams, after just one season. Now, this was coming off of a disastrous year where the Pistons were just 14-68, and, I can understand to some degree the overall coaching job from the Pistons and from Monty Williams was really bad. But the fact that the Pistons basically swayed him out of taking the season off last year, he was prepared to sit for the 2023-24 year to spend some time with his wife. He had just gotten a $20 million buyout from the Phoenix Suns after being fired there, and the Pistons made it a point to go out and get him. They give him a 6-year, $78.5 million deal, which was the highest paid coaching contract in the NBA at the time that he signed there. And now just a year later, they are firing him and still owe him about $65 million. So, this past year, like I mentioned, it was miserable for them. I have been a defender to some degree of I think that there is legitimate talent on this Pistons team, and obviously the record was abysmal this year, but there are some legitimate cornerstones to sort of build around, and I think that they should have been better than they were this year, especially down the second half of the year. It felt like they could have been competitive in a number of these games, but ultimately, from the point where they were starting Killian Hayes over Jaden Ivey for a bit there, and maybe some Pistons fans will defend that decision and say it was a little bit of the wake-up call that Jaden Ivey needed in terms of buying in on the defensive side of the floor, but I don't know. It was pretty messy there in Detroit, and ultimately, I'm just surprised at the timing of them pulling the trigger here to fire Monty Williams, where, it's so late in the offseason in terms of their season ended a month and a half ago, 2 months ago, and now they decide to go through with this, and when a number of the head coaching candidates have already been scooped up by other teams. Now, it's clear that, it sounds like this decision came from an ownership perspective. They just cleaned house, signed a new president of basketball operations, so they're looking for this fresh start headed into next year. But again, just very interesting the timing of this after the NBA Finals, where you haven't been playing basketball since whatever it is, early April, something like that. So ultimately, Monty Williams is out. Obviously, this just happened this morning as well, so we don't have a ton of details surrounding who the next top candidates are. Vincent Goodwell of Yahoo Sports did report that the Pistons are going to strongly consider James Borrego to replace Monty Williams. Feels like Borrego is a lock to be a head coach somewhere next season. The Lakers and the Cavs have also had some interest in him, so I think that one of those places are ultimately going to take him in. I want to sort of dive into the conversation in terms of the quality of jobs in these three destinations, but before we do so, some other names that could be thrown out in the head coaching search for the Detroit Pistons. Mike Inori has been a very popular candidate since he sort of took on a bigger role with the Timberwolves during the playoffs this year. Stepping in for Chris Finch, was the lead assistant for a team that just made the Western Conference Finals, so always going to be some level of buzz there. Sean Sweeney is a name that hasn't been very popular, it feels like, in a lot of these searches for the Lakers and for the Cavaliers, but the lead assistant for the Dallas Mavericks this past year, and he was actually a little bit of a familiar face for the Pistons, where he was in Detroit for 3 years under Dwayne Casey a number of years ago as one of the assistants there, so at least a familiar face to some degree. Sweeney would be. And Chris Quinn is another name that it seems like he is going to eventually be a head coach in the NBA, one of the top coaches under Eric Spoelstra. He interviewed for the Pistons last year before they ultimately went heavily after Monty Williams. So not sure whether or not they revisit that. Obviously, they interviewed him just a year ago. What is going to change in their eyes, but at least something to consider. And then one other name that I haven't really heard much buzz about, but I think that Sam Cassell would be a good candidate. Nobody has really given him the time of day just yet, but a former player. He's been coaching since 2009, so what's that, something like 15 years now that he's been an assistant coach. He's currently with the Celtics. Now, he was sort of the third option to some degree in the coaching tree in Boston this past year, where Charles Lee was the number 2. He just got hired by the Charlotte Hornets to take over as their head coach next season. So I would imagine that Cassell is probably going to replace Lee in that aspect. And maybe it's next off season that he ends up generating some more attention in terms of being a head coach. But we'll see. Again, sort of just speculating here because it is very recent news and we don't necessarily have all the answers as to who the Pistons are looking at just yet. But coming back to this idea of ranking the head coach jobs that are available in the NBA right now between the Cavaliers, the Pistons, and the Lakers, that the three I just put it, that is how I would order them. Cleveland, Detroit, LA. Now, based off of the talent on the roster alone and the long-term upside of potentially being able to build something, I really do love the building blocks that the Pistons currently have. I'm a very big believer in Cade Cunningham, and I do think that both Jaden Ivey and Jalen Duren are potential cornerstones as well. That would be a guard, a forward, and a center to build around. Cade, you could even say, is a little bit of a guard himself to some degree, where he's a little bit of this, modern point forward type build, but again, having sort of size-wise at least, one of each already. They just drafted Osar Thompson as well, 5th overall last year. If he can develop some type of a threatening shot, he could be a real contributor for this team as well. Does a lot of stuff along the margins, the rebounding, the defense, that would help to build a culture in my eyes. And, having those four for being a 14-win team last season, it's a very solid core in my opinion. The issue with the job, though, is the ownership, which is a very large concern. The way that we just saw them sort of lure Monty Williams in last offseason just to give him all this money and fire him a year later. And I think it goes beyond just that. I mean, you look at the way that they have handled from a basketball operations standpoint, some of the contracts, the Marvin Bagley one in particular wasn't great. And the fact that, I mean, for whatever it's worth, I don't know if there was much else on the table, but kind of got nothing out of Bogdanovich and Alec Burks from this past offseason. Who knows, maybe from this past trade deadline. Quentin Grimes, maybe he ends up being something. Malachi Flynn dropped 50 points, I think it was, late in the season. But, overall, I don't think that they just haven't been. It's not even an I think thing. They have been very mediocre to bad for the majority of, since the early 2010s. They made the playoffs that one year with Blake Griffin. So the instability outside of the roster would be my number one concern. But honestly, if I'm a coach trying to, establish long-term success, I do think that the Pistons can be a team you're likely going to have a little bit more of a longer leash. I know Monty was just fired, but I think that the Pistons' approach last year was to try and go all in and make this team. They feel like they're due for a jump, sort of like Oklahoma City was, or maybe even Orlando was. But it's going to require a little bit more patience. You would hope that the ownership group understands that, but we don't know if they do yet. So I have them at number 2 behind the Cavaliers. I think that the Cavs are still going to have to make a trade, so I don't know if the roster you're going to inherit when you take on this job is going to be consistent for years to come. They have 4 all-star worthy, all-star caliber players in Darius Garland, Donovan Mitchell, Evan Mobley, and Jarrett Allen. Garland and Allen have made all-star games in the past. Mobley showed possibly the most amount of offensive upside he ever has in his career, at least on the biggest stage that he's played on so far, with his postseason performance during the playoffs, specifically after Jarrett Allen was injured, I should say. Like I mentioned, I think that they do have to make a deal a little bit, but either way, they have assets, and we'll see what happens with Donovan Mitchell, whether he wants to re-sign long-term or what. But even if they have to ship 1 or 2 of those players out, they can still get something back in. Ultimately, there is some stability there. When you talk about the Lakers, stability is far from the word I would use to describe this, because obviously it's an honor coaching that type of an organization. It's a dream to be able to coach the Los Angeles Lakers, but at the same time, you have no idea where LeBron James is going to be in 2 to 3 years. If he does leave, what's the plan with Anthony Davis? With Anthony Davis, can you trust him to be as healthy as he was this past year, played the most amount of games in his career in year 12, now headed into year 13 and his early 30s. Is he going to be, I can't imagine he's going to be more available. You have to imagine it kind of swings back in the other direction. And behind those two, I just don't know how much you really trust the rest of the roster. I do like Austin Reeves, but outside of that, it's a lot of unknowns. And ultimately, with this Lakers situation, it's very heavy pressure immediately to win, and then in a couple years you might be thrust into a rebuild. And that's the thing, is you're just not really understanding what situation you're getting yourself into, what the both expectations both now and in the future are with that Lakers organization. Again, I feel like if the Lakers were willing to be all right with being a 6, 7, 8 seed and, being a playoff team for these last years with LeBron, it would be no big deal. But we saw Darvin Ham get fired, and he was sort of slaughtered on his way out by the media and by Lakers fans. That's clearly not enough for them. But I don't know how much more there really is for the Lakers, so I'm not trying to be a Lakers hater or anything, but I think it's a very tough position to be walking into right now, obviously outside of the prestige of it. But that is all the time we have for on that subject. So we are going to be moving on, taking a break to another big market where there are some debates as to what happened. The New York Knicks have not had much success up to this point in terms of working out a contract with forward OG Anunoby. So we are going to be diving into that next. Stick with us. We will be right back.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Absolutely free. College football, NBA, MLB, MA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast as we move into some conversations around the New York Knicks. And there seems to be some level of, you could call it discontent maybe, between OG Anunoby and the Knicks front office, where it has not been going great in terms of early contract negotiations. Under the new collective bargaining agreement, NBA teams are allowed to work out contracts with their current players before free agency officially opens. And it sounds like OG Anunoby will still be available by the time free agency officially opens, because they are not seeing eye to eye just yet, according to ESPN's Brian Windhorst. He said while making a guest appearance on Get Up that, quote, most people believe Anunoby will stay with New York, but there have been indications he may want to test the market because he's not thrilled with what the Knicks are offering. And this doesn't really surprise me ultimately, where OG Anunoby, it feels like he's been in the league forever, but he's still just 26 years old, and he could very much be in line for a massive contract extension, or a contract period, I should say, where I think he's going to get at least $35 million per year, possibly even up to 40 if one of these maybe smaller market teams, or if you look at a team that wants to compete and has a ton of cap space, specifically looking at the 76ers to that degree. But, there are going to be a number of suitors for him in free agency. And I'm not sure yet what the discussions have specifically sounded like between the Knicks and Anunoby. And I'm not saying that this can't eventually work out in a deal for the two of them, but it is a very interesting conversation where there is always a little bit of added pressure when you talk about trying to re-sign a player that you just gave up assets for in, talk about one season, but this was just half a year. So the Knicks ended up trading R.J. Barrett, Emmanuel Quickley, and the number 31 pick in this year's draft. In return, they got Anunoby, Precious Achiuwa, and Malachi Flynn. Now they end up flipping Flynn in the Bogdanovich and Burks deal, but I think that it's interesting when you evaluate what they gave up in this type of a deal. Emmanuel Quickley was going to get paid this offseason, and it didn't make sense for, even if he was going to be a restricted free agent, didn't make sense for the Knicks to match whatever deal comes across their way because they already have their small guard that is a heavy ball handler in Jalen Brunson, and Brunson obviously is a far better version. Now, it's nice to have a six-man option like Quickley, but he also probably to some degree even imagines a little bit more for himself. So I just don't think that those two parties, I should say, were ever going to come to any type of an agreement on that front. But also you have RJ Barrett, who had just signed this big contract with the Knicks 1 or 2 off seasons ago, and you know, Barrett is somebody that also, again, still very young, was in that 2019 draft class when they took him number 3 overall, and a lot of Knicks fans wanted to believe in RJ Barrett, and there's definitely still some room for hope, but at the end of the day, you know, OG Anunoby kind of provides everything that RJ Barrett does, but at a more consistent and more elite level. So you were almost moving on from a second round pick in a year that everybody hates the draft and a player you were going to lose in free agency for sort of your one trade chip player that you could see having a bigger role on your team, but you're making a direct upgrade at the position and also getting off a potentially bad contract. But that's where it ties back into Anunoby here, when ultimately, when you look at his career, he has been an incredibly, you know, a player that has just impacted winning. And I believe he is one of those players that every single team could benefit from having on their roster because of the fact that he is unselfish offensively, now partly due to limitations, no doubt, but somebody that doesn't need to be a primary ball handler, can still provide a threat on offense, though, even when the ball isn't on his hands, and plays elite defense, good rebounding, etc., etc. And we saw in 2019 where he was a big part of that Raptors team. So I like Anunoby a lot, and if I am a Knicks fan, I definitely want to see him staying in New York. Now, again, the price is where it gets interesting because the Knicks aren't all too expensive of a team at the end of the day. Their payroll for next season is listed at $154 million as things currently stand. Now, that's with Anunoby's $19 million player option that he is very likely to decline. But I think that once you start paying a player that, and the big thing with Anunoby is sort of the lack of reliability in terms of injuries, because we've seen him, especially in recent years, sort of struggle to stay on the court. Now, in 22-23, he played 67 games, so pretty solid there for the most part, but he has only hit that mark once in the past 4 seasons. He's played in 43 games, 48 games, 67, and it was 50 this year, including the fact that he ended up getting injured, which obviously during the playoffs there were plenty of debates in terms of, is this Tom Thibodeau's fault for overworking his athletes and his players? That's very much on the table, especially considering, it's one thing, it's the playoffs, everybody's going to play heavy minutes, and that is expected. But if you're working with somebody who has a history of injuries, you're playing a really risky game, I would say. And ultimately, you're also playing a risky game when you understand that he has some shortcomings in terms of availability throughout his career, and you're going to pay him $40 million because it does sort of handicap the Knicks. Now, this kind of thought that I lead to from there is the fact that if the Knicks didn't have to pay Julius Randle $30 million next season and $32 in the following year, that I would be probably more comfortable of spending money on OG Anunoby. Now, Julius Randle is a very polarizing player in a lot of NBA circles, considering the fact that he's been All-NBA in 2 of the past 4 years. He's been an All-Star in 3 of the past 4 years, and he absolutely provides a level of offensive creation that doesn't always look perfect, but when you look at the Knicks and how they were performing in the postseason, they needed a second player to be able to step up and provide something to help Jalen Brunson, as opposed to him just having to create everything for himself and others. And OG Anunoby couldn't be a second option on a championship caliber team, I don't think. So again, it's a lot of risks. You sort of have to know that you are going to be in that championship level of contention if you're willing to sort of maybe dip into that first, second apron of the luxury tax, and that you are going to be a lot more restricted with moves around the perimeter. And I don't know if the Knicks are necessarily there yet. It's been an awesome story for them, the way that Jalen Brunson has come and really transformed the organization, winning playoff series in both of the past 2 years. And they feel like they can continue to build, but in terms of how this is going to play out with Anunoby, I think he's going to hit the open market, and I think he's probably going to walk, which would be a little bit of a tough pill to swallow to some degree for Knicks fans. But I also do feel like there is some level of, when you're talking about, the overall Knicks and whether or not they can afford to make a move like this, I'm not sure if OG Anunoby is somebody you want to put all of your eggs into necessarily. And it's a difficult conversation. I don't think that there's an easy answer necessarily for the Knicks. I would like to keep OG Anunoby. Maybe if you could trade Julius Randle for another player that is going to be able to be a little bit more of a secondary scorer. But, players like that don't just grow on trees. So let me know your thoughts in the comments section. But we did have another player that was a trade deadline acquisition actually re-up with his team in the past 24 hours, where Pascal Siakam earlier this morning signed a contract extension with the Indiana Pacers. So we're going to be diving into that, but first we're going to take a quick break. Don't go anywhere. We will be right back.
Sports, entertainment, social media, movies, technology, finance, and weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast, as we're going to be diving into the Indiana Pacers re-signing Pascal Siakam, two-party agreeing on a contract extension this morning, 4 years, $189.5 million. Siakam was a trade deadline acquisition for the Pacers during the regular season, and so far it has really worked out, as he was, you can make an argument, their best player. Obviously him and Halliburton in a vacuum, or long-term building around, you choose Halliburton over him. But I thought that Pascal Siakam was just about irreplaceable for the Pacers during their playoff run this past year. And it has really worked out for them up to this point, where overall the deal was the Pacers traded Bruce Brown, who was the offseason signing for them, where they gave him a a team option, I should say, at $20 million a year. So they understood that if they needed to dish him, they very easily could. If it just didn't work out in year one, they could move on from him. Overpaid him a little bit, but for the sake of potentially making a move like this. So he was the overall, trade chip in terms of matching the contracts, but it was also Kyra Lewis, who actually came from the Pelicans. It was a 3-team trade just in that sense. And the Pacers also traded Jordan Nwora, 2 2024 first-round picks, and a conditional 2026 first-round pick. And in return, the Pacers got Siakam and a future second-round pick. So they gave up definitely a little bit more than the excuse my blank here, than the Knicks did in terms of their OG Anunoby trade at the deadline. But ultimately, Siakam is more of a creator. He is somebody you can trust more offensively. Again, Anunoby, I think he's a winning player, and I think that he's somebody that is worth a lot of money when he's on the court. But, again, this is a situation where 2024 draft picks just don't seem to be weighed the same as, draft picks in the future based off of the quality, or at least the reputation, of this year's upcoming draft. So the Pacers give Siakam just over $47 million per year, and they end up making the Eastern Conference this past year. I think it's a little bit of a no-brainer. He sort of fits in almost seamlessly to what the Pacers are trying to do, an organization and a team that decide to run as much as possible in transition. Off nickerness, they are looking to see if they can get a quick opportunity the other way, if not sell into their own offense. And Siakam has just been a really nice fit for them this past year. And it's something where when you are a small market team like the Pacers, it's one of those things where everybody in every fan of the NBA talks about cap space and how valuable it is. But in this league, more than any others, we see sort of on a somewhat regular basis that there's really only a few places that are real free agent destinations. When you talk about, LA or Miami or stuff like that, it's, for the stars of stars, that's kind of the way that it goes in the NBA. So you have all of this cap space. You have an all-star caliber player. I think he's possibly made an all-NBA team before. I can double check on that. But, you have this player who wants to re-up with you and has a really high upside and a winning effect on your team. Also, for whatever it's worth, this young Pacers team that is looking to, build themselves up as true contenders. Siakam has, championship experience when he was also with the Raptors. And yes, Siakam has been on 2 All-NBA teams. Now, he hasn't been on a team since 2021-22. Now, the Raptors have obviously massively declined from that point, and he and the Raptors were maybe a little bit of old news. But again, I think that this Indiana system that they run is a lot more conducive, I think is the word I'm looking for, of maximizing his talents. And I am excited to see what happens here with the Pacers moving forward. I meant to mention this earlier in the show. They make the Eastern Conference Finals, and they're another team that did sort of benefit from injury luck to some degree, that they didn't have to play Giannis and Lillard in the first rounder. Lillard played a couple games, but was dealing with injuries when he came back. I think they first hurt in Game 4. And then against Knicks, we also Knicks dealing with a number of injuries. The Pacers showed all year that they were, I know the latter half of the season was quite living up to the hype that they had built up in their season tournament run, but they showed they were a young team that is ready to start competing soon, and they massively overachieved this year going on to make the Eastern Conference Finals. It's something that they can continue to build on, and part of doing that was holding on past Siakam and just continuing. I mean, they have a number of really good players. I still think they are extremely deep, and this is a team that, again, nobody wants to give them any credit for the playoff run that they had. they played the Celtics closer than just about anybody else did, including the Dallas Mavericks did in the finals when the Pacers matched up against the Celtics in the Eastern Conference Finals. Again, I think that sort of provided the biggest moment of the Celtics playoff run was in that game one against the Pacers, because the Pacers kept it close, time and time again in these matchups, and ultimately losing Tyrese Halliburton to injury down the last two games of that series hurts them. It goes down as a sweep, but I think that it is possibly a little bit of an awakening for this Pacers team that feels like they can maybe be in the realm of contention sometime soon. And I also just like to see, small market teams try and build themselves up a little bit internally. Obviously, they go out and trade for Siakam, so it's not like he's homegrown talent necessarily. And you look at Tyrese Halliburton, and to some degree as well, they traded for him. But they are kind of building from the ground level and getting these younger players to all buy in at the ground level. And I don't know, I still think that the Eastern Conference is very open heading into next year. We're going to have to see how the Knicks and the 76ers and the Heat all treat themselves during the upcoming offseason. But if I didn't mention the Bucks there, but I think that the Pacers are a much tougher team than people give credit for. And ultimately, a situation where adding some for another handful of years is just going to get Tyrese Halliburton again. You're not going to overtag one individual player and have somebody. Obviously, he has his flaws, and he now is able to at least space out floor a little more than he has in the past. You look at also sort of how the Celtics were able to handle him in the postseason. It feels like that was a little bit as well of the fact that the Celtics have played Pascal Siakam in a handful of different, at least the one in 2020 in the bubble is the one that really comes to mind. So that could be it in terms of the Celtics facing off against the Raptors in the postseason. But it feels like there is some level of history there. And, Siakam, again, just for whatever it's worth, he definitely raises both your floor and your ceiling. And he's not ever going to be the best player on a championship team necessarily, but he can be sort of the piece that helps solidify you in terms of not being top heavy and being able to compete. But let me know what your thoughts are in the comment section. We're going to head into our final break of the show, and when we come back, we got to talk some hockey because the Edmonton Oilers are still living, still hanging on there after going down 3-0, back-to-back wins for them. So we're going to be diving into all of that. Stick with us. We will be right back. Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast for our final segment of the day, where we are diving into the Edmonton Oilers, continuing to keep their season alive, just sort of hanging on for dear life at this point, and they are now dragging the Panthers back to Edmonton. And I would say the pressure is officially on for the Florida Panthers. We got an incredible Game 5, which saw the Oilers win 5-3. So we will start from the Oilers' perspective here. Is there officially special teams heading into the series and early on here? And I'm not sure officially ready to claim they're back, but people have advantage in this Game 5, which will have the winning seconds of the power play. So it got good looks, and even on the possessions that didn't either. But ultimately, it was a couple instances late in the power play that they were able to capitalize. In the second period early on, Evan Bouchard saw that the clock was winding down. He just sort of let it rip with a deep slap shot, knowing that it was possibly their last look with the advantage, and it happened to bounce off of Zach Hyman and into the net for Hyman's first goal of the series as a whole. The NHL's leading goal scorer in the postseason, had been scoreless through the first 4 games of this series and wasn't necessarily on a shot of his own, but you'll take it any day of the week. And then later in that second period, just one of the most masterful plays you will ever see from a hockey player, from Connor McDavid, McJesus, where he just dangled his way through 3 different defenders and pretty much gift wrapped the perfect scoring opportunity for Corey Perry, passed it across the crease, and he finished it off there. So, these are the second and third power play goals for Edmonton in this series. The first one came on what I believe was a 4-on-3 in Game 4. So finally some 5-on-4 goals, and maybe this Edmonton Celtics is going to kick into another gear because we've seen the penalty and how dominant they've been. I believe Florida's still scoreless in the series so far. So it's going to be massive for the Oilers, especially being backed up in the corner a little bit to some degree, knowing there is really room for mistakes. Make sure you talk the penalties that you when you get the opportunities, a massive part. But as we take on decision here about special teams, Nate started for the Oilers when it was Connor making the read. The Oilers were on the penalty kill. There was a cross-ice pass from Brandon Montour, and Brown was put it off and set it. Panthers down the ice and put a beautiful move to stretch out Sergei Bobrovsky and finish off the goal. Somebody Brown, who looked like he was going to be a non-factor through the majority of the regular season for the Oilers, and he comes up with a big goal. This is the second straight game that they have a shorthanded goal. We've seen a number of them from this Oilers team in the past 2 rounds, and you have to tip your cap because, they are winning these special teams battles right now. And I do want to circle back to Connor McDavid here, where, like I mentioned, on one of those power play goals, just an absolute beauty, working his way through the zone to set up Corey Perry. He now has 8 points in the last 2 games and has been the main catalyst, I would say, for the Oilers working their way back into this, and they're doing so with some great play from Stuart Skinner as well, who you have to give a lot of credit to. He's been borderline flawless with the Oilers' backs up against the wall, facing elimination so far this postseason. Somebody who was very heavily criticized by myself, including to some degree, during his Western Conference Finals performance against the Dallas Stars. He's excellent for them, but the offense has been what's really getting them going. We're 13 goals in, their 2 wins so far in this series. And we've seen McDavid be at the center of it, has surpassed McGriff for the most assists ever in a single postseason. He is currently at 34 in that category, along with 8 goals, which put him in the realm of doing unthinkable and passing Wayne Gretzky for the most points in a single postseason. Now, an uphill battle to get all the way there. Coming into the playoffs, Gretzky had 4 of the top 5 spots, and now with 42 total points, Connor McDavid has entered the top 4. The 3 records ahead of him are Gretzky in 1988, 43, Mario Lemieux in 1991 with 44, and then, of course, Gretzky, his record of 47 points in 1985. So, to reach number 1, it's going to take 5 points in the it's going to have to be 2 games as well, obviously, as they still trail the series 3-2 if they're going to win. They need it to go 7. So from that perspective, at least, it would be 5 goals, or 5 points, I should say, in 2 games. But, I mean, already, this is just about as magnificent of a debut for a player to the stature of Connor McDavid as you could possibly ask for. And it's great to see because, we talked about this when I had some of our other hosts on the show a few weeks ago, that for Connor McDavid, just making it to this point in the postseason is already, tremendous. It can't hurt his legacy whatsoever. NHL doesn't have the same level of toxic fan bases that necessarily tear down players like that for making it far and not finishing the job. But to see McDavid being at the center of this resurgence from the Oilers as well. It's just been that much more special. And the fact that now, if you look on the majority of sports books, Connor McDavid is now the favorite to win the Conn Smythe Trophy. And it's really interesting. There's only been 5. Is a great thing for the sport of hockey. And it's going to be interesting